So we're going to walk through how to use the table saw here in the wood shop at MakeHaven. Just off the get-go, we're going to talk about what kind of a tool this is. It's a table saw, and it's a specific kind called a sawstop. That's the brand, but it also refers to one of its functionalities, which is that if the blade detects that it touched something that resembles a human body, it will rapidly stop itself. So that's pretty awesome. It's a great safety feature, but as we're going through, it's important to keep in mind that we're going to learn how to use the table saw, so that's hopefully never a functionality that we need to actually use. So I'm going to grab a piece of wood just to help explain how the table saw functions. And looking at this piece of wood will help inform us what the table saw is for. So when we're looking at this piece, we can see from the end of it where in the tree it went. So looking at the rings, we can see that this sat in the side of a tree going vertically. And what this means, this refers to how we're going to cut the piece of wood, both dimensionally and with reference to the grain. So cutting it this way is called ripping, and in general on the table saw we use it for ripping, so cutting pieces of wood the long way. When you're dealing with things like plywood and OSB, the reference to the grain may not still apply, but we still use it dimensionally, so cutting the long way is still referred to as ripping, and that's in general, with some exceptions, what we use the table saw for. So when we're using the table saw, we're going to think about a whole bunch of things. Hopefully it looks like this when you arrive. If not, make sure it looks this way when you leave. So I'm just going to point out some things. That the top is clean. It's important that the top is clean so that it's very flat, so that pieces sit flat and smooth and slide smoothly. The blade guard assembly is attached. This is the default one. It collects dust from the top. There's a riving knife and pawls built in, so there are only a few exceptions for when this tool should not be being used. And there are no tools on it. All the accessories are up on the wall, and it's ready to use. So when it comes to the sawstop functionality, we're going to start by going inside the tool. Whenever you're trying to modify the tool or go inside of it, you need to make sure it's what we call double dead. So it's off in two ways. And in this tool has two switches. So we can make sure that it's off with the on-off paddle switch as well as the main switch. So both of the lights are off, the switch is down, so we see that the tool is double dead. So we can move the fence over and lift this up. By lifting this little tab, we can remove the table insert. And then we lift the gray handle down in here. By lifting the gray handle, it releases this the blade attachment, the blade guard assembly, and then we can come around the table, tying this up here. And so we'll especially do this if we are cutting it and don't need that. So with that out of the way, we can look inside here and we can see two things. One of them is the sawstop cartridge, and so that's a block of aluminum that will get launched up into the blade to rapidly stop it in the event that it is contacted by something particularly wet. What this means is that if you're cutting wood that's particularly wet, you need to take some other precautions so as to not accidentally set it off. The other thing we can see when we're in here is how to change the blade. So we'll walk through how to change the blade on the table saw now. The tools for changing the blade are on the side of the machine. So there are two wrenches that live down here, and we take them out. They have an open end and a closed end. The open end goes on the inside, and the closed on the outside. And then hopefully it shouldn't be too tight, and you can undo them. And then the rest you can do with your hands. What's important to note as you're taking the nut and washer off are that you don't drop them down to the vacuum hose. It's not catastrophic if you do, but you have to take the vacuum hose off to get the nut and washer back out. So you note that as we're taking this off, the washer sits so that it's cupping the blade. So that cup is facing towards the blade to hold it on. So I'll take those off and take this blade out. When it comes to table saw blades, the important consideration is really the number of teeth per inch. There are others, but in general that's what we're concerned with. So when you look at this blade, it says that it's a combination blade, which means that it can do both ripping and cross-cutting, which is cutting against the grain. And it has a fairly average number of teeth. So if we're looking at this, it has probably 3 teeth per inch, 2 or 3. And that is enough to cut quickly through wood while also leaving a decent edge. The more teeth per inch that you have, the nicer edge it leaves, but the more slowly it cuts. With fewer teeth per inch, it cuts more quickly but less nicely. So we can go up to where the blades are stored over here to the other blades. And so we have a few other blades here for the table saw, and they're labeled up on the wall. So this is where the combination blades live that have sort of average number of teeth. This is a coarse tooth ripping blade. So you can see it has maybe 1 tooth per inch. So it will go really quickly through soft woods. And it's specifically for ripping. So it's for going down the long dimension of woods, along the grain, and that's its specific purpose, but it will leave a fairly ragged edge. This tool is the fine tooth. It even says an ultimate flawless finish, because every tooth only has to take out a very small piece of wood, so it can leave a nice finish on the edge. So if you're working on something that's going to be visible and you want it to be really clean and smooth, this is the blade to use. But for now, this is the blade we'll put in, and in general, this is the one you should leave in when you're done using the tool, because it's the most versatile. So when we're putting the blade back in, it's important to remember that the blade is spinning towards you, so the teeth should be facing towards you. So the text is facing to your left. So put that in, and then we put the washer back on, cupping the blade, try not to drop it, and then the nut goes right back on. Tighten that first by hand, and then using the wrenches. When you're tightening it, it doesn't need to be super tight, but firm is good enough. And then we put the tools back down here. There are 2 instances where you would need to change the blade cartridge. One of them is if you're using the Dado blade, which is a wider stack of blades, and so you need a wider block of aluminum. The other is if this cartridge were to be deployed because you cut wet wood or you injured yourself. In any event, the way to do that we'll go over now. So there's a little red handle on the cartridge down in there, and so you turn the red handle and the pin slides out, and then afterwards this whole cartridge slides out. So this is the cartridge, and this is the block of aluminum that gets launched up into the blade. And we can actually look up at the wall to see one that was already deployed to get a sense of what that looks like. So this is one where it was deployed when the operator cut through some moss on a piece of wood that was wet enough to deploy the blade. So it's a fairly violent occurrence because the blade stops very rapidly, so it makes a loud noise and it drops down into the table as further protection. So definitely something you want to avoid, but definitely a finger-saving functionality. So the rest of the other cartridges are stored over here on the shelf. There are 2 cartridges generally left here. One of them here is the normal brake cartridge for the normal size blade, and the other one is the Dado brake that's just wider. And then they live right here under cartridges for table saw. Luckily, the one we're using is just fine, so we can put that one back in. And putting it back in, after it's been deployed, is you have to just lift this whole mechanism by hand back up. So you reach down and you lift it all up until it clicks nicely. So you have to lift pretty firmly. If you're just switching it, you obviously don't have to do that. So we're going to put this one back in, and there's a little port here that plugs in, so you just have to get that aligned and then push it snugly in. So we'll blow the dust off first just to make sure it sits nicely. And then it sits right down in there. So after the cartridge is secured back in there, which you know because the red key is pushed firmly down, then we can start using the tool. So we're gonna, before we continue, put the blade guard assembly back in. So you can do that just by lifting it off the hook and putting it in. Now one feature of this is that it's connected here, so if you want, while you're cleaning off the table, this is connected to the main dust collection tool, so you can just remove this and use this to vacuum up the table. There's no need to get another vacuum. So when we're putting this back in, it's important to put the pawls up so that they don't get stuck under the table. So this is done by lifting these up and latching them right under these little hooks, and then sliding this back in the crack, seat it down. It'll be a little wobbly, but then you tighten down the gray handle until it stops at the bottom and it is secured. Then when you are reinserting the table insert, you put it in from the front. Something that's really easy to do is to put it in so it sits on top. It's important to slide it in from the front so that it sits flush. And then lowering the handle and lowering the blade guard. So that table's good to go. We can see what happens when we turn it on, because there are two lights in the front that will tell us some messages about what the machine is thinking. So it takes a little while to warm up, to do its little boot up process. And once it does, so right now it's unhappy, so it's blinking red, and you can go on a little cheat sheet on the side to see why it's blinking red. And my guess is that the cartridge is not seated firmly. So if we go down, it says blinking red means turn cartridge key to on. So we didn't fully seat it. So let's make sure that is fully seated. So by reseating the cartridge, the blade is now happy. All it took was blowing a little dust off of it so that it could seat more fully and pushing down firmly so that the red handle stops completely, and then the brake cartridge is fully seated, and now it is happy. So as I mentioned before, there are two switches on the table saw. The one on the right is the main power switch to turn it on and off, and then this is the one that activates the blade. You can obviously tell that it's a large blade, and the purpose of that is so that it's easy to hit. So when you're working on the table and you want to stop it, you can hit it with your knee. So it's called a paddle switch or a knee switch. So you can keep your eyes and hands on the table, and then it's really easy to just push your knee in that general direction and turn it off without having to take your eyes and hands off the table. Let's just go over some more sort of tools that we use on the table saw. The very important one is the fence. So the fence is used for ripping. You loosen it or make it movable by raising this handle. So you can slide it and then clamp it down by lowering the handle. The position of the fence is read out on the right side. So this indicator shows the distance between the left face of the fence and the right face of the blade. So that's that distance, and it's important to verify that if you're doing really precise cuts, but that's what that number is supposed to read out. To that point, when you're doing rip cuts, it's important that the wider, you keep in mind that this is in general the piece that you're keeping. This is certainly the wider piece of wood, and so you need to orient it so the wider piece of wood is on this side of the blade. The fence can be removed, it can be moved to the left side, but in general it's used most of the time. Some other tools we have up against the wall here. So we have a whole bunch of push sticks, and the purpose of push sticks are to help you move pieces of wood through the table saw without having to get your hands near the blade. Some are meant for wider sheets. My personal favorite is this push stick. It's wood, which means it gets damaged. That's fine, we can just make another. I also like that you can hold it from the top and push down, and it applies a lot of force down on the top of the wood so that it keeps it in place. So you can both apply forward force because of that little notch in the back, but you can also keep the piece firmly down on the table. There are a few other push sticks. This is a riving knife, and the purpose of the riving knife is it's a few fold, and so it's actually included in this blade guard assembly. So if you raise the blade, can see that part of this blade guard assembly is this riving knife. And the purpose of that is so as wood goes through, it can't slide back into the rear of the blade, then launching forward. I'll turn the machine off as I'm showing you this. So it's called kickback when that happens. So when a piece of wood is going through, but it catches on the rear part of the blade and gets launched back at you, is called kickback, and it's fairly, maybe not fairly frequent, but it's a very real risk. So that leads to a few other consequences of how you use the machine, but the riving knife helps to prevent kickback a great deal. If for some reason you can't use this blade guard assembly, a few examples are if you're using a sled, which we'll get to later, or the fence needs to be really close, or you're doing a cut that isn't all the way through, in which case the wood would hit this, then you can remove this whole assembly, hang it up, and just use the riving knife. And so that sits in the path, but it sits just at the height of the blade, so it eliminates a lot of those other problems. So that's the purpose of the riving knife, and it lives right up here. A few of the other tools are the feather board. So the purpose of the feather board is to act as an additional hand to hold a piece of wood in place. So if your piece of wood is here, this can act as a hand that's closer to the blade. You just apply a moderate amount of force and then turn these, which drop magnets down onto the steel table to hold it in place. So now you can comfortably keep your hands back here and push it, and it will be supported laterally from this feather board. The feather board also helps to reduce kickback by having the feathers oriented in this direction, so moving backwards is more difficult than forwards. And to release it, just do that and hang it back up on the table. This is the table insert for the Dado blade. It's just significantly wider, and then here is the Dado blade. The Dado blade is something that we can go over now. So as you saw how to take out the cartridge, and so you will need to take out that cartridge and put in the Dado cartridge, which is significantly wider. And then the way we use it is by stacking up multiple blades. Each blade is 1/8 of an inch thick. So we have these two blades, and then on the flip side, we have these blades called chippers, and so those stack in as well, and they're also each 1/8 of an inch. Underneath the chippers are these shims, and with the shims you can stack up to get very precise spacings. So as you add these, you could use the calipers or do test cuts to make sure that you get the exact spacing that you want. It shows the arrows on here, the direction in which it spins, and we know that the blade spins towards us in the table saw. And so then you would put this in on the arbor and stack them up successively. And then obviously make sure that this other one is oriented properly, and each of the subsequent teeth in the middle is oriented so that the carbide tooth is pointing towards you when it spins. So these two go on the outside, and then these go in the middle. Obviously just making sure to align them so that they don't overlap, so that they alternate. And that's all that is involved in the Dado set when you're trying to do wide cuts in the table saw. Which means that when you're using the table saw, it's important to have this gate closed, so the air isn't being sucked from the planer, it's being sucked from the table saw. Going to the table saw are two hoses, the wider hose going to the bottom and the thinner hose going to the top. And it's elevated so that all your pieces can pass comfortably underneath it. But when you want to use the table saw, you just flip that switch and it activates both the top and bottom so that you can vacuum. If you need to remove the top blade guard assembly, the tube is thinner, so the airflow is restricted, so it will still be sucking significantly from the bottom. So you don't need to remove this or plug this or anything if you have it removed. This is the table router, and if you're doing cuts that need to be supported after they come out, if you don't have someone here to hold them for you, then the table router rolls and can sit right over the motor. So as long as the motor isn't tilted at an extreme angle, which you'll see how to do later, this can slide right here, and the piece can slide right off onto the router cable to support it. If for whatever reason this isn't an option, then over by the column are rollers that you can set up both before and after the table saw to help support the piece of wood as they're going through the saw. So the last of the attachments that we will be looking at now are the various pieces, the jigs that go on, that are stored under here. So they are mostly for cross-cutting, so we will get to them after we finish ripping, because ripping is what we do mostly with a table saw, but you know that they're here. And as long as we're looking down this way, we'll look at the two signs. This is warning about kickback, so it lists a few of the ways that you can prevent kickback, and then a sign showing how the table saw should be left when you're done, which we'll get to when we're done. Something that I did forget to mention is just another tool built into the guard assembly to prevent kickback are the pawls. These pawls, P-A-W-L-S, are usually down, and as the wood slides through, they bite into the wood. So if the wood were to try to shoot forward, it grabs into it so that it can't shoot forward. If you were doing some really fine work on a soft wood, then you might want to keep the pawls up, because as they drag across the wood on a soft wood like pine or spruce or even poplar, they can, even going this way, leave a slight mar on the wood. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. So we're going to look at ripping now. Ripping is when you cut along the length of a piece of wood. It's a more difficult cut to make because it introduces a preference for the blade. The blade wants to travel in the path of least resistance, which means it'll try to go in between the grains in the less dense part of the wood. Obviously, if the piece of wood is going through the saw and then is moving left and right, that's no good. So you need to make sure that the wood is well controlled so that it doesn't do that. So the way that we make sure that that's the case is by standing perpendicular to the table. So if the wood does come out, it shoots past you and not into you. Your left hand stays planted, so your left hand does not move, and this takes a little practice because a lot of the time people want their hand to move with it, or they want to move their fingers along with it. Don't do that. Your left hand stays planted. I usually keep my palm pressed against the corner, and you push both down and into the fence. So you keep it firmly there so that it can't slide and it can go up. This blade is a bit like a ram, so as the wood comes into it, often the wood will try to raise up, and that's why it's important to keep the piece of wood down. When you're cutting on a typically longer piece of wood, your hands will come together, and you don't want your right hand to continue. You certainly never want your hand in the red area around the blade, but even as your hands come together, you go over and you will already have put the push stick right here, so you'll just reach over and take the push stick and continue the cut with the push stick. So your left hand again stays planted, and your right hand holding down continues the cut all the way through. It's important that even though the piece may be cut, you should keep pushing the piece of wood all the way through past the blade so it doesn't sit next to there where it risks getting caught and shooting back at you. And again, your body's perpendicular, and then when you're done, you keep your hands and your eyes on the table, and then you can just use your knee and tap the switch easily with your leg. So that's conveniently very easy. That when you're doing the cut, to keep the the wider piece of wood in between the fence and the blade. So in this case, if we were trying to produce a 2-inch piece, we would have that 2 inches be like this. So the 2 inches was on this side versus on the outside. The reason for this is that in this orientation, it's much easier to twist around the blade, which will bind up and cause kickback. So that's why it's important to have the wider cut always on the inside. Another consideration is that the blade has inherent thickness. It's removing wood. It's not just cutting through it. So we refer to this as kerf. And the kerf of the blade is somewhat variable. In general, these are thin kerf blades, which means somewhere in the vicinity of 0.09 inches, though there is some variability. So you want to measure it. If it matters, I'll ask you to be very precise, and there are calipers up on the wall. In terms of adjusting the blade height, there are 2 adjusters on the table saw that we use frequently. The one on the front controls the blade height. So you loosen the knob in the middle just a little, just as long as it's not tight. And then you can turn clockwise from the blade up or counterclockwise to bring it down. To determine how high you want the blade to be, you have it so that the teeth are just exposed above the top. You want it so maybe half the gullets are the space in between the teeth, and you want it so that about half the gullet is exposed. The reason for this is that you want the sawdust to be able to evacuate to the top, but you also want the majority of the cutting of the teeth to be cutting the wood, as opposed to the face of the blade being touching the wood, because then it's just heating up the wood and it's not cutting it. So for this piece of wood, we lower it to just about there, so that the sawdust can escape, but the teeth are touching the wood. The other adjustment we can do on the blade is the angle of it. The angle is done right on the side, and in the same way we loosen it, and then we turn the crank. So you can actually see the blade turning, and in addition, the entire motor is turning. The angle is read out here, so you can see the approximate angle, and then you can get a proper tool to measure the exact blade angle if you need to be more precise. Something important to keep in mind is that the motor is lifting up in the back, so if you have the outfeed table over the motor, they'll interfere with each other. So you need to pull the router table away from the table saw if you're going to go to like a 45-degree angle, for example. When you're done, it's important just to return the blade back to 0 degrees for the next person, and then lock it down so it doesn't vibrate out of place. So that covers most of the important pieces for ripping, and then we'll talk about cross-cutting, and then I'll show you an example of both. Cross-cutting is when you cut against the grain, and as long as we're talking about this terminology, I'll mention resawing, where it's cutting through the second longest dimension of the wood. So this being the longest, this being the second longest, and this is the shortest. Resawing is typically done on the bandsaw, but not exclusively. So when we're cross-cutting wood, there are a few different considerations. You're no longer running with the grains. You don't need to have quite as much restraint holding the wood or constraints holding the wood into a certain orientation, because there aren't as many forces fighting against it. Do keep in mind, though, that especially with softer woods, they'll have resinous pieces, the little branches came out, and those are significantly harder than the rest of the wood. So if the blade hits that going in any direction, it will slow the blade down significantly and can change direction. So keep in mind of where those resinous or knotty pieces are. Another point along those lines is that the feed rate, the rate at which you push the piece of wood through the blade, is going to change for the wood that you're cutting and the blade that you're using. In general, you just want it to feel comfortable. You don't want to feel like you're fighting the motor. You also don't want to go so slowly that you start to see burn marks and whatnot from the blade sitting against the wood for too long. So that's something that you sort of develop a feel for and just develop a comfort for it. But if you see burn marks, that could be an indication actually you need to go faster or slower depending on the situation. So for cross-cutting, we move the fence out of the way. The reason for this is if we were to use the fence while we're cross-cutting, it would be really easy to do a minute angle change and for the wood to bind up and throw back at us. So when we're cross-cutting, the fence goes out of the way, and then we have a few options for cross-cutting. So one is using the miter gauge, which is particularly useful for doing angled cuts. So we put the miter gauge in, and then here you can loosen the handle to attain a certain angle. Now so that it can turn in both directions, and it can also sit in either of the two grooves. So it just depends on the orientation and your handedness. So it sits in the grooves, and we'll just set it to 0 degrees for now for convenience, but it could be at a different angle. In this situation, you don't want your hands to be in the red area, so you do whatever you need to do to do it safely. So in this scenario, if we were cutting a piece off, we could hold it like this, so with our two hands so that our whole body is out of the way. And in this scenario, there's relatively little risk for kickback. So you just make sure to hold it firmly and pass all the way through. Now, a point of note is that in general, the table saw is only used for cross-cutting when the chop saw is not a proper option. So the chop saw is the default tool for making cross-cuts. We only use the table saw when we can't use the chop saw. And so an example of that might be if the piece was really wide, wider than the chop saw could pull forward, or we were doing a certain angle, or we were doing half laps, or something where it was the chop saw wasn't the proper tool. So this we would cut on the chop saw, not on the table saw. But for the point of demonstration, you could hold it like this, you could turn the angle, you could also take another piece of wood and screw it on here to act as a bigger fence. In fact, we may have a jig down here, which is just that. So this is just a much bigger fence that slides on. So for whatever your purposes, that might be useful. So this is one of the tools, and we can inspect the thing again. It's called a miter gauge. Another one of the tools that we can use is a sled, and so a sled is kind of what it sounds like, and that you put the wood in the sled, and it only goes one way, so just make sure to orient it the right way, and then it slides through. So you have a big piece, or say you had a cutting board and you wanted to trim off the edges, then this might be the most convenient way of doing it. So you place your piece in here, and you can hold it or clamp it or however you like, and slide the whole thing through. Now you can clearly see that this isn't going to work with this table insert. So this is one of the scenarios, where you need to remove the table insert and hang it up so that you could slide the whole piece through. You just replace it with the riving knife. There are a number of scenarios where this is useful, and there are different sleds. They're for different angles and different purposes. And just because I'm remembering now, I'm going to re-mention that you definitely don't want any long sleeves or necklaces or hair that could possibly get into the blade. So because there are times as you're pushing through that your body is extended over the blade, and so you want to make sure that all that is tied and taken care of, so it's not interfering with the tools. So the sled is the other option for cross-cutting, and there are a few other jigs that you're welcome to use, but those are the two general areas. For a lot of things, we make jigs that are appropriate for that particular use, and if you do make one, that's great. Just do make sure to label it well so that other people know how to use it, because it's not always apparent looking at some configuration of how or what that piece might be used for. And then when you're done, it slides and goes right back in here. I forgot if I mentioned, but this only goes in one direction, so there are arrows on it to show you which way it goes in. The blade isn't located in the center of the groove, so it only fits one way. So now I think we can demonstrate how to use it. So when you're using it, as always, it's important to be wearing safety glasses. I'll just point out here that on most modern table saw blades, and blades in general, there are carbide teeth on the steel blade. So the carbide is very hard, so it can get very sharp, but it's also quite brittle. So if you do hit any metal, obviously you shouldn't have any metal in your wood. You should make sure to remove any staples or things like that. But if you did hit anything particularly hard, the carbide can break off, and it's moving quite fast. So it's like a bullet, and so it's, even if you're not the one working on the tool, that's why you need to be wearing glasses if you're in the shop area, because the pieces can break off and they're dangerous to you anywhere you are in the room. And that applies to a lot of the different tools. So glasses on, we're going to go over here to get ear protection. Between the vacuum and the saw, it's pretty loud. And we probably don't need a ventilator for this purpose. Because we're able to suck from both the top and the bottom, we're collecting most of the dust. But if we weren't able to use the top, then we'd probably want to turn the air filtration system on to make sure that we were getting as much of the dust out of the air as possible. So again, we're going to turn the first switch on, and I'm going to show you here, if I could, how we put the machine into bypass mode. So say you're cutting wood that's particularly wet, or maybe has moss on it, or there is, for whatever reason, there's some risk of the blade going off improperly. You could use a humidity meter to detect if the wood is particularly wet. Another way is to put the machine into bypass mode, which will tell the machine not to react. So it's bypassing the safety, and you can touch the piece to the blade to see if it reacts to it. So if I were to take my finger and touch the blade right now, it would show a little red dot to say, hey, the blade's not running, so we're not going to do anything. But if the blade were running, it would activate the machine. And so you could take your piece of wood and touch it against there and say, well, it's not reacting, so that's at least an indication that the machine would be okay with it. The way you would put it in bypass mode is you, this right from here, you turn the key to the on position, or all the way to the right. So you saw it blink red once, and now it's blinking green. We turn it on. It blinked red again, and now we release it. So now as it's blinking green, that says that it's in bypass mode, which means that if it touches something wet, it's not going to stop. To turn off bypass mode, you just switch this off. It blinks quickly as it's slowing down, and turns off completely. Another note is that when the blade is slowing down, sometimes people will try to turn it back on as it's slowing, and it doesn't like that. It needs to stop completely before turning it on. Along those lines, the machine is connected by a belt to the motor, so even as it's slowing down, it still has a lot of momentum to it. So you need to wait until the blade is completely stopped moving before getting your hands near the blade. Because even as it's slowing down, if you were to touch it, it would very easily cut through your body. It's not like once it's slowing down, it's, you know, it could be stopped easily. So we have our ear protection, eye protection, the machine is on. We are going to grab a piece of scrap wood to cut. Here's where here I'll just mention that when you have scrap afterwards, it should go into the scrap area only if you think it could be of value to someone else. Which means it's not marred, it hasn't been lasered or cut up or cut into, so it's a fairly significant piece, or it's a hardwood of some size. And then you find the appropriate place in the scrap area for it to go. If there's no space for it, you can either take it home or put it in the trash. But it's more important that we keep the space clean than we keep all of the scrap. So only put the scrap in that area if there's space for it. So we will, let's say we wanted to cut a 1-inch piece of this wood. We would move this over until the readout says 1 inch. And then we clamp it down. If we wanted to verify, we could get a measuring device to measure that distance. Because it's about in the middle, it doesn't really matter which side the blade is on. I think it may be a little thicker than 2 inches, so the majority of the wood is on this side. We'll get the feather board to hold it against the fence as sort of an extra hand. So we push it up against here, lock it, and then we make sure the blade is at the right height, so you can lower the blade so that it sits just a little bit above the wood. And then we're going to lower this, turn the fan on, and then walk through the steps. So as you're going through, try to picture yourself doing it, so when you come in, it's, you just already know all the steps. Next is the cross cut. So we're going to move the fence out of the way. We're going to remove this because we're going to use the sled. So we need to put these up, remove the feather board, take the table insert out, make sure that the blade, the machine is off when we're going inside of it. Moving this. And and then replacing it with a normal riving knife. And now we can take the sled piece of wood, and again now we need to raise the blade to match the piece of wood. So bring the blade up, clamp it down, and then we're just going to turn the vacuum on and make the cut. So after using the machine, it's important to clean it up, to leave it how you found it. So the scrap is going to go into the trash. So this is definitely trash worthy, and this someone might use. So we'll put it into the appropriate bin. The sled goes back under the table. The machine is turned off. The blade is lowered. And then we're going to replace the proper insert. And then last but certainly not least is cleaning off the surface. So we'll just turn on the vacuum.